A property tax notice for a condo I'd never heard of led me to discover my husband had spent 2 years and $340,000 of our joint savings secretly buying and paying off an apartment for another woman. My name is Priscilla Nakamura Odom, and before this happened, I believed I understood the people I trusted and the life I had built. The property tax notice arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early autumn, addressed to my husband at our own house, which in itself was not unusual. We got all kinds of mail for Desmond Whitfield because he handled his life the way a man handles a loaded briefcase he does not want anyone else to touch. Flyers from conferences, client gifts, insurance paperwork, a stray Christmas card from some coworker I had never met. All of it landed in the same basket by the front door until I sorted it on the weekends. What made this envelope different was the printed parcel number on the upper corner. It was not for our house. It was for a condominium in a building I had never heard of, 3 miles from where we lived in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. At first I thought the county office had made a mistake and printed the wrong label. I even laughed under my breath because the address looked absurd sitting there on our kitchen counter, among the utility bill and the grocery receipt and the mortgage statement for the home I thought I knew inside and out. I sat down at the table to pay bills the way I did every month, one of the quiet routines that kept a household from falling apart. Desmond was not home yet. He had texted earlier that he was stuck at dinner with clients and might be late, which was so common by then that I barely noticed the message. I opened the notice, read the parcel number twice, and then again, more slowly, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something ordinary if I gave them enough attention. They did not. The tax notice identified a condominium unit in a mid-rise building downtown, not far from the river. The owner of record was Desmond Whitfield, listed alone. Not Priscilla and Desmond. Not a trust. Not a business entity. Just his name, clean and solitary on the county record, as if he had always occupied a different version of his own life that had somehow escaped my notice for 2 full years. I remember staring at the page for so long that the afternoon light changed across the kitchen cabinets. My first instinct was not rage. It was confusion so complete it bordered on physical dizziness. I thought maybe there was some investment property he had forgotten to mention. That seemed unlikely, but I had been married to Desmond for 15 years. People kept private corners. People sometimes made decisions before they found the right words. I told myself there could be an explanation that sounded less devastating when spoken aloud than it did in my head. I did not confront him that night. That choice was not calm exactly. It was strategic, even if I did not yet think of it that way. There is a difference between silence and surrender. I understood, from years of living with Desmond, that if I brought him this paper immediately, he would talk first and explain later, and those explanations would be polished and rehearsed in real time, until I was the one apologizing for being suspicious. That was his skill, not cruelty in the dramatic sense. Something subtler and therefore more dangerous. Desmond had a way of making a question sound like an overreaction before it fully left your mouth. He could soften a corner, slide a fact into another shape, and leave you feeling as if you had misread the room rather than discovered a lie. I knew that about him long before I knew what this property notice meant. Desmond and I had built what looked, from the outside, like a stable middle-class marriage. I worked as a hospital pharmacist, mostly on the inpatient side, where the days were long, the pharmacy phones never stopped ringing, and there was always at least one nurse hurrying in with a medication question that needed immediate confirmation. Desmond worked as a regional sales director for an industrial equipment manufacturer. That meant travel. It meant dinners that started as networking and ended after 9. It meant airport delays, client entertainment, site visits, and more uncertainty than a person in a marriage should perhaps have accepted as normal. But I had accepted it because for many years there had been no reason not to. We had been married 15 years. We had no children. We had a tidy house, 2 sensible cars, and a joint checking account we both used for nearly everything. We were not the kind of couple who split bills down to the penny. We pooled. We trusted. We built our household with the assumption that whatever either of us earned belonged first to the family we made together. That arrangement had never seemed naive until the afternoon I found a tax bill for a condo I had never seen. I waited until Desmond texted that he was on his way home. Then I slid the envelope into a file folder with the other bills and went back to the work of the evening. I cooked chicken, answered a refill question from a resident who had forgotten to check an interaction, folded laundry, and acted normal. I had to make myself do it. Normal was suddenly an act, and I understood with uncomfortable clarity that the act mattered. When he came in, he kissed my cheek, dropped his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, and complained about the traffic on I-270. He looked tired in the easy way of a man who knows his dinner is waiting. His tie was loosened, his shirt cuffs rolled once, his expression mild and familiar. He asked what was for dinner. I told him chicken with green beans. He said that sounded good. Nothing in his face told me he owned a condo 3 miles away. I watched him eat and listened to him talk about a supplier meeting that had supposedly run long. He mentioned a client from Dayton, then another from Akron, then said something about a possible contract extension that would keep him busy through the end of the quarter. I nodded when it felt appropriate. I asked a couple of questions. I laughed at the place where he expected me to laugh. By the time we went to bed, the property tax notice was folded in my file drawer, and the old version of my life was already gone. I did not sleep much that night. I lay next to my husband and listened to him breathe, and my mind kept returning to the same terrible possibility that he had bought a place for another woman. It was the most humiliating explanation, and also, from the perspective of the tax bill, the one that fit too neatly to ignore. I hated that my own thinking had landed there so quickly, because once a woman sees the shape of betrayal, it is hard to unsee it. But I also knew enough about myself to admit that instinct is not always paranoia. Sometimes instinct is simply the first accurate thing your mind has had time to say. The next morning I searched the address on my lunch break in the staff lounge at the hospital. I did not search Desmond's name first. I searched the condominium address. The county site pulled up a basic record, and there it was again. Desmond Whitfield as sole owner, purchased 2 years earlier for $340,000. I stared at the screen until a pharmacy technician asked if I was okay. I said yes, because that is what people say when they are not okay in public. Then I started doing what I do best when something is medically or financially wrong. I gathered data. I printed the county record. I checked our joint statements from the previous year. I opened my own memory like a cabinet and began pulling out every fragment that suddenly mattered. The evenings he stayed late, the conferences in cities I never visited, the times he had insisted on using cash for a dinner when our cards should have been enough. The renovation language he used whenever he transferred money out of the joint account, always in chunks that looked plausible in isolation. That was the detail that made my stomach turn before I had any larger proof. For nearly 2 years, Desmond had been moving money out of our joint checking account in amounts labeled home renovation, contractor deposit, materials, and once simply project balance. I knew those labels because I had been the person reconciling the household budget. I remembered seeing them and not thinking much of it because our kitchen had needed work. The guest bathroom had needed work, and Desmond had mentioned wanting to refresh the back deck. There was always a renovation plan in the abstract. There was always some future project that made the transfers sound reasonable. Except our house had not been renovated. Not in any serious way. There had been no contractor in the yard, no dumpster in the driveway, no tile samples laid across the kitchen counter, no interruptions from plumbers or electricians. One faucet in the kitchen had been replaced because I had ordered it myself after the old one started dripping. I remembered that purchase because I researched 6 models during one Sunday morning coffee, and because I had to remind Desmond to approve the charge when it hit the card. If you live in a house and somebody tells you $30, $40, $50,000 has gone toward renovations, there are usually signs. There had been none. The realization that the money had gone somewhere else did not arrive all at once. It came in layers. First the condo, then the transfers, then the sheer size of the amount. $340,000 was not a vague sum. It was real in a way. Numbers on paper are not real until they begin to resemble loss. It was years of savings, salary, bonuses, discipline, and the practical sacrifices of ordinary life. It was the reason we had not taken certain vacations. It was the reason I had agreed to delay some upgrades to the house. It was the reason I had told myself we were being careful for our future, and he had spent it on a place I did not know existed. I spent the following 11 months on a private investigation I never would have imagined in the first 14 years of my marriage. I say 11 months because that is the time between the day I found the notice and the day I filed for divorce. But the work inside those months was relentless in a way calendar dates do not capture. I was still going to work, still making dinner, still attending family birthdays and hospital meetings, still acting like a woman whose life made sense. Then late at night, after Desmond fell asleep, I would sit at the kitchen table under the pendant light and spread statements across the surface like a map. I made a spreadsheet so detailed it began to feel less like household bookkeeping and more like forensic accounting. I traced every transfer out of the joint account that contained the words renovation, repair, contractor, supplies, installation, or materials. I matched dates to bank withdrawals. I checked whether those days lined up with business trips or weekends when Desmond had supposedly been out of town. I cross-referenced his credit card statements where I could see them. I compared the transfers to the county purchase date for the condo and then to the mortgage records I pulled from the recorder's office. It was slow work, tedious work, the kind of work that makes you realize how many lies can be hidden inside convenience and routine. At first, I looked for a single giant transfer that would explain everything. I did not find one. What I found instead was a pattern, which in some ways was worse because patterns require intention. The money went out in increments. 12,000 here, 8,000 there, 15,000 labeled as cabinetry, 7,000 labeled as fixtures. A few weeks later, another transfer. Small enough not to trigger suspicion, large enough, over time, to build a fortune for whoever was receiving it. The condo mortgage, I later learned through public records, was paid off within 8 months of purchase. That detail chilled me more than I expected. It meant the place had not just been leased or used casually. It had been bought, paid down, and secured with astonishing speed. Somebody had wanted ownership, permanence, privacy. Somebody had wanted the apartment free and clear. I still did not know who was living there. That was when I hired Marisol Vance. I found her through a recommendation from a friend of my sister's who had gone through a long custody dispute years earlier. Marisol was not flashy. She did not promise anything dramatic. She listened carefully, asked precise questions, and treated my story as a problem to be documented rather than a scandal to be admired. I liked her immediately for that. When I explained the property notice and the transfers, she did not widen her eyes or gasp. She asked for copies. She asked for timelines. She asked what I already suspected and what I still needed to prove. I told her I needed to know who used the condominium and how often. 3 weeks later, she had the answer. The woman living there was named Colette Fenwick, 34 years old, event coordinator for a hotel chain. No one I would have known by name from my own life. And yet once Marisol showed me the photo she had pulled from public sources and social media, I recognized her immediately. Not because we were friends, because I had met her once before, 3 years earlier, at a sales conference Desmond's company held every spring at a downtown hotel. I had been there as a spouse guest. I remembered the stiff carpet in the ballroom, the breakfast buffet, the rows of branded notebooks, and the way Colette had stood behind the registration table, smiling too brightly at 100 tired attendees. She had handed me a badge and a lanyard. I had thanked her. That was all. It is possible to pass close to a person in your life and have no idea they will someday become the center of your pain. Seeing her face again made my skin feel too tight. Marisol continued watching the building and quietly documenting routine. Desmond's visits became harder to explain away once they were mapped against his reported business travel. He was there too, sometimes 3 evenings a week, and often on weekends that he had told me were consumed by client dinners, supplier events, or the occasional overnight trip. He would text me from the road with a photo of a hotel window or a restaurant table, and some harmless comment about the food. I had saved many of those messages over the years because they seemed unremarkable. Now they looked like props in a production whose script I had never been handed. I did not confront him, not even after the first report from Marisol. I needed more than a suspicion, and I needed the evidence to be organized before emotion polluted the record. This was the hardest thing I have ever done. People imagine discovery as a single shock, a dramatic revelation that releases you from uncertainty. In reality, it is a long stretch of doubting yourself while the facts slowly become impossible to dismiss. There were nights when I stared at a statement and wondered whether I had somehow misunderstood my own marriage for 15 years. There were moments when I wanted to throw all the papers into the trash and ask him directly because ignorance would have been easier than this precision. But precision was the only thing that would save me. I told only my sister Wren. I did not tell my parents. I did not tell coworkers. I did not tell anyone in the neighborhood whose friendly questions might have sharpened into gossip. Wren lived in Cincinnati, but she drove up twice during those months when I could not stop myself from needing another human being in the room. She sat at my kitchen table while I worked through statements and tax records, and she did not try to entertain me or distract me or tell me it would all be fine. She just stayed. The first time I told her about the condo, she actually put her hand over her mouth and then let it fall away again. How long, she asked? At least 2 years, I said. Maybe longer. The purchase was 2 years ago. The transfer started before the deed record even cleared. She looked at me for a long time after that and said, "You're not going to confront him tonight, are you?" "No," I said. "Good." That was the word she used, and in that moment I felt something in me settle. Not because good was the right moral category, because it meant somebody else understood that patience was not the same thing as weakness. My coworkers noticed that I had gone quiet. The pharmacy at the hospital is never a calm place for long. There are alarms, phone calls, medication shortages, angry families, physicians asking for substitutions, and the constant pressure of needing to be exact in a system where exactness matters. I was good at that life because it matched the way my mind worked. But during those months, I was carrying a second concentration under the first. My friend Odalis Farrow, who had worked in the pharmacy longer than I had, finally asked me if everything was all right at home when we were doing inventory on a slow afternoon. I almost told her everything. Instead, I said, "I'm dealing with a difficult personal matter." She gave me a long look that was both compassionate and respectful, then said, "If you need time, say so. We'll cover." That offer mattered more than she knew. It meant I could keep functioning without the fear that my face was giving me away as often as my heart was. By the 4th month, I knew I needed legal advice. Not because I planned to file immediately, but because once a financial pattern like this starts coming into focus, you stop being only a wife and become an injured party with rights you need to understand before anyone has a chance to shift the board. I found Wilhelmina Castellano through a referral from a coworker's sister who had used her in a business dissolution case. She had the directness of a person who had no interest in wasting my time, which I appreciated instantly. When I laid out the documents in her office, she did not interrupt me once. She let me explain the property notice, the transfers, the condo records, the investigator's preliminary report, and the monthly pattern of disguised withdrawals. Then she asked whether I had copies of our tax returns, retirement statements, and every accessible bank record. "I can get them," I said. "You need to get them without alerting him," she replied. "If he doesn't know you're looking, he can't start hiding anything new." That became the new rule of my life. Quietly secure, quietly document, quietly preserve. I made copies after work, during lunch, on weekends, and in the odd half-hour windows when Desmond was in the shower or outside on the patio with a drink and a business call. I changed passwords where I needed to. I photographed paper documents before putting them back exactly where he expected them. I stored backups in a secure folder and then stored backups of the backups. Wilhelmina explained what mattered under Ohio law in plain language. Marital funds used during the marriage to acquire separate property could still be subject to reimbursement or offset in a divorce. In other words, the fact that the condo was titled only in Desmond's name did not magically wash away the origin of the money. If marital assets had been used to buy it, that value still belonged inside the divorce calculation. Hearing that was the first time in months I felt anything like steadiness. He had not merely cheated. He had redirected our life together into a private asset and hoped I would never know enough to ask questions. I filed for divorce quietly, through Wilhelmina's office, rather than sitting him down and announcing it. She advised service through the formal process because it created a clean legal record and reduced the chance of any last-minute move on his part. I agreed. By then, I wanted very little from Desmond except accountability and a full accounting of the marital estate. I no longer believed he would give me either voluntarily. The day he was served, I was at work between patients. I remember standing in the medication room with a bottle of IV potassium in my hand, checking the clock because I knew the process server was going to reach him at his office sometime that morning. I did not feel dramatic. I did not feel powerful. I felt strangely empty, as if a part of my life had been sealed in a container and shaken until all the air left it. He called me 20 minutes later. I saw his name on the screen and actually waited a few seconds before answering, because I needed to keep my hand from trembling. "What is this?" he demanded the second. I said hello. His voice was sharp, stripped of the easy polish he usually used around me. "It's a divorce petition," I said. There was a short silence, then a burst of questions. Had I lost my mind? What was I doing? Why was I humiliating him at work? Could we please talk like adults? I let him talk until he ran out of steam. Then I said, "I know about the condominium. I know about Colette Fenwick. I know about the transfers labeled as renovation expenses. Your attorney can speak to Wilhelmina Castellano. I won't be discussing this with you directly." He tried to interrupt. He tried to say the word condominium as though he had never heard it before. He tried to insist there was an explanation I had misunderstood. He started with irritation and moved quickly into outrage, which was the moment I knew I had been right not to warn him first. A man who had nothing to hide does not sound startled enough to forget his own strategy. "Priscilla, listen to me," he said. "This is not what you think. Then it should be easy for your attorney to explain," I said, and ended the call. For the first time in months, I slept a little that night. The proceedings that followed lasted almost a year. I would not call them easy. I would not call them satisfying. They were orderly, and that order was what I needed. Desmond's first response through counsel was to claim the condo had been funded by a separate consulting side income. According to that version of events, he had always intended it as an investment property, and I had somehow known about the money without objecting. Wilhelmina dismantled that claim in stages. She produced transfer records showing the money came directly from our joint account. She attached the descriptions used in the transfers and compared them to our house records, proving that the supposed renovations never occurred. She showed that the condo mortgage had been paid off in a time frame that aligned with the diverted funds. She lined up dates, amounts, and document trails so cleanly that his story began to look less like a defense and more like a confession delivered by someone who had not read the evidence folder. Desmond's attorney then tried a softer angle. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe he had planned to tell me. Maybe some of the money had been intended for our future together. Maybe I was overreading a private relationship issue into a financial mistake. That did not work either. When the data is this strong, lies become very expensive to maintain. I never walked into court expecting a dramatic scene. I did not need one. What I needed was for the numbers to hold, because numbers are stubborn when the paperwork is good. We exchanged financial disclosures. We reviewed retirement balances. We argued over the valuation of the condominium and the marital home. We discussed whether the property should be sold or retained by Desmond as separate property with offsets to me elsewhere. We debated the fair amount of compensation for 2 years of diverted marital money, and every conversation confirmed how far apart his version of reality was from mine. At one point, Wilhelmina asked me whether I wanted to pursue a criminal complaint. I thought about it seriously. I thought about the temptation to turn this into a public punishment, to force a courtroom into the role of moral theater. But the more I considered it, the more I understood that a criminal case would not necessarily recover the money in a way that served my future. The civil divorce framework, while less satisfying on a visceral level, was stronger for the actual redistribution of assets. It would get me my home, my share of the retirement accounts, and an offset tied to the condo's value. What I wanted was not the symbolic spectacle of handcuffs. I wanted financial repair. So I chose the cleaner path. That decision did not make me feel noble. It made me practical. During that year, I learned how much emotional energy can be spent simply remaining upright. My routine at the hospital continued because patients still needed medications regardless of my marriage. I filled prescriptions, counseled people on side effects, caught dosage errors, and answered questions with the same calm I had always used. I smiled when necessary. I took lunch breaks in my car when I did not want anyone to ask me how I was doing. At home, I ate dinner with the man who had built a second life 8 minutes away from our front door. Sometimes he looked at me with irritation, sometimes with charm, sometimes with the wounded expression of someone who believed himself the real victim because his lies had finally been interrupted. He asked a few times to talk in person. Wilhelmina advised against it, and I agreed. Any conversation with him in those early weeks would have become a negotiation over my emotions, and I refused to let my pain be rebranded as instability. If he wanted to explain himself, he could explain it in writing to a lawyer. My sister kept me grounded through all of it. She called at least once a week, and when I sounded too tired, she would simply stay on the phone while I folded laundry or made tea. She never told me what to feel. She only reminded me that I was allowed to be furious without becoming reckless. That distinction mattered. There were moments when I wanted to send Colette Fenwick a message or drive downtown and stand outside the condo building just to look at the place he had bought with our money. I did none of those things. I stayed inside the boundaries of the case because anger without direction would have cost me more than the betrayal already had. Sometimes at night I would replay the earliest clues and wonder how many times I had seen them without understanding what they were. A business trip that landed suspiciously close to the condo building. A dinner that seemed to last too long. The faint smell of a perfume I did not own when he came home one Friday. The way he had once laughed when I mentioned wanting to repaint the guest room because, he said, "We've got bigger things to think about." At the time I thought he meant work or saving for the future. Now I understood he meant his other life. That realization was painful not just because I had been lied to, but because the lies had been nested inside ordinary tenderness. He was not openly cruel every day. He brought me coffee sometimes. He remembered the brand of loose tea I liked. He asked about my patience. He got my car serviced without being asked. That mixture of affection and deception is part of what made the betrayal feel so destabilizing. It is easier to leave a man who is only terrible. Harder to leave one who can still sound kind while taking money from the account you share. Marisol continued to provide updates as needed, though her work became less central once we had the living arrangement and timeline established. She confirmed Desmond's pattern of visits and noted that Colette's apartment windows often reflected a man's silhouette in the evenings. She also documented that Desmond rarely stayed overnight during weekdays, unless he arrived after dark, which suggested he had been balancing the appearance of a married routine on one side and an affair on the other with a level of calculation that made my skin crawl. I did not ask Marisol for unnecessary details. I did not want the intimate version of his betrayal. I wanted the architecture. When the divorce negotiations reached the serious stage, Desmond's position changed. He was no longer interested in proving he had done nothing wrong. He was interested in minimizing the damage. He agreed to settlement talks. He proposed compensation structures that would have left me too little and him too much. Wilhelmina rejected them one by one. The marital home became a central point of negotiation. We had lived there for most of our marriage. I had planted the small hydrangea bushes out front. I had chosen the kitchen backsplash. I had paid the mortgage on months when his bonuses ran late. I did not want to lose the house simply because Desmond had decided to siphon away a condo's worth of money to another woman. Wilhelmina argued hard for me to keep it outright, and eventually that is what the settlement gave me. He retained the condominium. I retained the house. In addition, I received a share of his retirement accounts calculated to offset the value of the condo and the money he had diverted. It was not a perfect restoration, because divorce almost never produces perfect restoration, but it was enough to matter. It was enough to acknowledge that the money had not disappeared into thin air just because he had hidden it behind a title record and a lie. There was one afternoon during mediation when Desmond finally stopped performing confusion and just looked tired. We were in separate rooms, communicating through attorneys and a mediator, and someone brought over another spreadsheet, another set of valuations, another line-item explanation for how the assets would be divided. I never saw him directly in that moment, but Wilhelmina told me later he had said something about not realizing how far this would go. That almost made me laugh. Not realizing is what people say when they mean they did not expect consequences. I did not gloat when the settlement was finalized. I signed the papers, I left the office, I drove home. That was the end of the legal battle, which is not the same thing as the end of the emotional one. There is a strange emptiness that follows the conclusion of a fight you have been carrying in silence for so long. For weeks afterward, I would find myself reaching for my phone, then remembering there was no more evidence to compile, no more statements to reconcile, no more calls to make to Marisol or Wilhelmina or Wren about the latest filing. Desmond left the house within days of the divorce being final. He had the condominium, after all. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he stayed there full-time for a while and then became less visible socially. I did not seek updates. I had enough of him already. A few months later, one of his former colleagues mentioned that his employer had begun an internal review after rumors circulated about his expense reporting. Apparently, some of the client dinners he had claimed overlapped suspiciously with the times Marisol had documented his visits to the condo. I never learned the full outcome. By then, I no longer needed the company's judgment to confirm my own. I did, however, learn that reputations have a way of collapsing under their own weight once the hidden machinery starts to show. The one time I did feel a surprising need for closure was when I thought about Colette. I never reached out to her. I never sent screenshots or accusations or moral speeches. I considered it briefly and then decided it was not my burden to rescue or punish a woman who might have known exactly what she was doing. Marisol had noted that Colette's social media contained almost no photos of Desmond for the entire 2-year period. That absence bothered me. It suggested discretion, and discretion in affairs often means someone is aware of the cost. But I did not need her confession for my case, and I refused to spend my energy on a theory I could not prove. Wilhelmina told me once, near the end of the proceedings, that the clients who emerged strongest were not always the ones who cried the most in her office. They were often the ones who kept functioning while they built the cleanest records. I remembered that later because it described me better than I would have liked. I had kept the house running. I had kept the hospital work moving. I had kept a normal face at dinner. All the while, I had been building a file thick enough to tell the truth when I was finally ready to stop speaking in private. That observation changed the way I thought about strength. It was not dramatic. It was administrative. It was endurance with a filing system. I told my parents only after the divorce was final. I had not wanted them worrying while I was still trapped in the middle of it. When my mother heard, she cried. Not because she was surprised exactly, though she admitted later that she had sensed something was wrong. She cried because she hated the idea of me carrying all of it alone for so long. I told her Wren had known. I told her I was not alone, even if I had been quiet. That seemed to help. My father said very little at first, then asked if I was safe and if anything else needed to be done. I told him no. I appreciated that he did not try to make it bigger than it was or smaller than it was. Betrayal is already dramatic enough without spectators inflating it. Once the dust settled, I stayed in the house. Keeping it was more than a practical decision. It was symbolic in a way that mattered to me privately. Desmond had used our shared life to fund a secret apartment. I had used the truth to keep the home I had actually helped build. The house was not perfect. It still had the same layout, the same front steps, the same neighbor who watered her flowers in the evening and nodded at me over the hedge. But now every room belonged to me without qualification. 2 years after the divorce, I finally did the kitchen renovation we had supposedly been paying for all along. I chose the cabinets myself. I picked the counters. I replaced the backsplash with something brighter and easier to clean. I upgraded the lighting. And yes, I kept the same faucet for a while longer, because by then it had become a small, stubborn symbol of everything I had survived. When I finally replaced it, I kept the old one in the garage for reasons that were maybe half sentimental and half absurdly practical. I labeled the folder with receipts, real renovations, as a private joke to myself. Every line item in that folder corresponded to actual work on the actual house. It felt good to have an expense that meant what it said. There are small moments I remember more vividly than the larger legal milestones. The first time I opened the new kitchen cabinets and realized I had chosen them for myself alone. The first night I sat at the table after the remodel was finished and heard no one else moving through the house. The first time I looked at the joint account history and understood it as history rather than a present wound. The first time I said Desmond's name out loud without feeling my stomach tighten immediately afterward. The 11 months between the property notice and the divorce filing were, in some ways, the hardest part. Not because they were the most dramatic, but because they required me to live with knowledge before I was allowed to act on it. I had to sit across from the man who was lying to me and let the ordinary world continue. I had to listen to hospital alarms, cook dinner, answer patient questions, smile at family gatherings, and preserve my own mind from the urge to explode too early. That patience was not natural, it was chosen. I think people underestimate how much courage can look like restraint when the consequences of acting too soon are severe. If I had confronted Desmond the moment I found the notice, he might have covered his tracks, moved money, changed stories, or convinced me there was a perfectly harmless explanation. He was good at that sort of thing. By waiting, I gave the truth time to collect enough evidence to survive him. That does not make the experience beautiful. It does not turn betrayal into wisdom. It only means I left with something more than heartbreak. I left with my house, my share of the assets, my records, and a clear understanding of exactly what had happened. Sometimes I still think about the condo building. I have not been inside it. I do not want to be. But I know its address, and I know that somewhere within those walls, Desmond once believed he had built a private world that would never be seen from the outside. He was wrong. The wrongness of that belief is what saved me. If there is any final lesson in this story, it is that paper matters. Statements matter, dates matter, quiet observations matter. A tax notice that seems like bureaucracy can turn into a map of your own life if you are paying attention. I had spent years believing trust was a feeling. After all this, I know trust is also a record of what people do when they think no one is watching. Desmond thought no one was watching. I was. And that, more than anything else, is how I walked away with the truth, the house, and enough of what had been taken from me to start again.